Okay. Good afternoon. I want to thank the council members and staff for being here, as well as I know two commissioners are here, and I think John Carroll is on the phone. So we'll do a little roll call and allow you guys to open up and point out the lack of a physical quorum, which was anticipated, but this is an information only, and so the commission and any council members here, this was all noticed so that everybody could hear information about our resource planning. There was an agenda. I'm going to read that agenda in, and we'll go from there. One was introduction to the state of the Alexandria utility system, challenges, opportunities. 1A was the interplay of rate reform with the different aspects of the several utility departments, including electric, water, gas, and sewer. And by the way, we covered all that in our first meeting. 1B was state of the AUS. We're going to defer that, Mr. Fowler, to the next meeting when all folks are here. I don't maybe anticipate even a vote then, but nonetheless, we're going to wait till everybody's physically present and go over that. We gave a tiny snapshot of that with the management analysis the other day about where things generally stand, so all of you have some idea about that in a way better place than where we were a few years ago, but we'll have more to say on that. 1C was rating agency issues, grant and intergovernmental compliance issues. The council members are aware that there's things there we need to talk about. The commissioners aren't necessarily, but we will in a nutshell. But because of things that are happening, we're going to face the potential threat of downgrade until we get some of these rate reform issues right. And that's a bad thing because it stops us from being able to borrow or bond out on needed infrastructure projects. And especially when the utility is doing so well, it's such an easy thing to fix if we would get about the business of doing it. But that's another day. 1D is conclusions and action items about the final report. We're not going to cover that. Item 4 is political changes in rate-making domain, the duty to act, malfeasance. That's more for the council after you guys act, so we won't do 4. What we will cover today are 2 and 3. 2 is enterprise fund operations versus general city operations. And 3 is we will hear from GDS, who is our subject matter expert on, generally speaking, about rate study, internal resource planning, future public comment and participation process, and we'll talk about that as it comes up. So mainly, in short, you all are here to hear from GDS, and they're going to give you our IRP overview of the Alexandria utility system. This is up-to-date information. CLECO puts one out. Entergy puts one out. These are, generally speaking, can be found in the public domain because of the Public Service Commission, even for investor-owned utilities. In fact, they can be quite detailed if people want to dig through and rummage through them. So you're going to get a pretty detailed overview here about where we stand. As I've reported to the council, it's going to be good news to you because the bet you made from the AUSP all those years ago, Mr. Scott, to today panned out and is still, quote unquote, in the money. And what we have to think about is, okay, what's the future from here? So I want to congratulate you as an original member. I'm glad to have June serving, especially as a consumer customer member. I think that's important to have voices from the community about that to listen. And we'll get started in a moment with the IRP. Let me just read in the scope of the commission again for those who don't know. The Commission on Utility Reform and Equity, what we call C.U.R.E, was and remains formed to provide for the comprehensive study of all aspects of the city's several utility departments, including electric, water, gas, sewer, wastewater, to make recommendations for any rate reform, to implement a best utility system practices in the respective departments of the city, to address any privatization issues as they have come up over the years, to provide interim oversight of related matters as they may from time to time be needed. Also, it is to rank the desirability and best community opportunities and options for any things that we should come up with over this state and time. We can publish, I think all of that is actually under the transparency tab. We can talk about it more later. So I'm going to turn it over to GDS to do that part, and then I'm going to follow up with some general things again about how the utility works, what's on your bill, what parts fuel costs, the simple things that we want to keep reminding the public about. And with that, I will turn it over to Ms. Meyer to introduce everybody, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Thank you. So prior to GDS's presentation, I will do a roll call. Ms. Crenshaw? Ms. Davis? Here. Mr. Scott?
Here.
Mr. Carroll?
Here.
Mr. Fowler as ex officio? Thank you. And with that, I am going to turn it over to GDS. GDS is our engineer of record for all of our utilities here at the City of Alexandria with regards to rates, integrated resource planning, which is the IRP that you're going to see that they're going to discuss here today. This is something that all utilities look at, not just the City of Alexandria through the AUS, but all others, including Lafayette Utility System as well, which is also a municipal-owned utility. So they're going to talk about projections that are going to look out 10-plus years. This is something that is very important for the solvability of a utility system. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ernesto, who is here in person, and we also have on the phone Chris as well with GDS, and so they are going to get started talking about the IRP, and they're also going to go through some of the acronyms for you because there are a lot in this industry. Ernesto?
Sure, thank you for that introduction. We've got the presentation on the screen, and as you alluded to there, we will get to acronyms in 1 minute. Just wanted to provide sort of the structure for the conversation today. At first glance, we want to introduce ourselves. Not familiar if folks are aware of GDS and the services that we are able to bring to the table, but wanted to speak to that for just a little bit there, a minute. And then certainly to delve into the background of why an IRP is a positive process and is helpful in bringing sort of a dialogue of all stakeholders together as part of the planning process for the power supply situation that you're approaching. So with that, we'll also talk about the scope of work for this study in particular, and we'll jump into some of the IRP results and ultimately some of the recommendations that GDS is making for your consideration as a result of the process. So the slides include a lot of abbreviations, industry standard abbreviations, and they, that information can sort of get lost in the weeds. So we wanted to provide this acronym table so that we can either refer back to it or provide you all with hard copies to take away from today's conversation. But they include the types of generation that we're looking at, everything from battery energy storage systems to combined cycles, gas plants, combustion turbine plants. The IRP, we introduced that. It stands for Integrated Resource Plan. It's the overall study. We are in the MISO footprint, which is the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, an aggregator of load and resources. And so we'll talk about why that's important as part of the study and some of the interaction that occurs with your resources and the takeaways from that. We've also got things like purchase agreements, power purchase agreements with other independent suppliers. We've got planning needs defined as this PRMR. We'll get to that when we talk about capacity, for instance, and we'll explain what that is exactly. And then, again, the RICE abbreviation is tagged with your existing DG Hunter plant. For instance, that's the technology that's brought to bear there, the reciprocating internal combustion engines. We've got SAE through the load forecast slide. We'll talk about that briefly. And of course, your hydro purchase is from the Southwestern Power Administration, so we'll touch on that. And when we talk about capacity, we'll briefly cover the zonal resource credit, which is sort of the acronym in the industry when you're in the MISO market regarding capacity. So just a 30-second introduction on GDS. We were founded in 1986. We've been around for 38 years. We've got just shy of 200 employees. We have 8 offices nationwide. Our business is truly nationwide, East Coast to West Coast. We participate in varying degrees in all of the established markets that exist and unstructured markets. For instance, we work a lot in the southeastern region of the country that is not in a market like MISO. The function of each of these offices define sort of the personnel that's located there. Our headquarters is in Marietta, Georgia, and that's where the bulk of our employees are, about half of the companies there in Marietta, Georgia. And folks, for instance, that work on rate studies for water, wastewater utilities are based out of our Austin office, just to highlight a couple of things that are relevant there. And let me say that over 80% of our consulting business is with public power entities. We work with municipals and electric cooperatives across the country. We work for some IOUs in a limited fashion. That's typically to provide DSM and energy efficiency type solutions as part of that work. So our power supply planning business is in this public power space, and so we're able to leverage that as part of projects throughout the country. This just covers the variety of services we provide. We have a diagram here that, well, we, throughout the chain of energy and capacity, from the wholesale level down to the distribution level, we provide a variety of consulting services that cover power supply planning, to cost of service rate studies, to consideration for transmission, and folks that are certainly real engineers and build those substations, design those substations that you see locally. So we're familiar with the entire value chain of the energy business. And lastly, here, just over the last 5 years, we've worked, as an example, with over 50 different municipal and joint action agencies on power supply planning efforts. So we've certainly faced a variety of goals, challenges, and trying to come up with creative solutions. So we leverage that as we approach new projects. And City of Alexandria is up there.
Ernesta.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hey, Ernesta.
Yes, Chris.
Yes, Chris.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that you take a few minutes just to tell these fine folks a little bit about your personal background and your experience and your connection with the Alexandria utility.
Sure, Chris. So briefly, I've been with GDS since 2001, and through that time, I've worked on power supply planning, strategic efforts, integrated resource plans. I've worked on requests for proposals for both traditional generation and renewables. I have faced challenges in talking with boards about divestiture of assets because the market may have changed. And so those are really hard conversations when, folks who may have been around at the start of legacy assets that are no longer functioning in the market or providing sort of a margin that was expected, talking about, well, what's the future of that asset? So, and certainly here over the last 5 to 7 years, I've been involved with a lot more renewable type solicitations as utilities consider, well, how can I, incorporate some of that into our asset mix. For City of Alexandria specifically, Chris and I both worked on the original integrated resource plan that was done back in 2011, 2012, that sort of produced some pathways for your consideration and landed on the power supply mix that you have today as part of that effort. And it sounds like we have folks that were around for that decision-making process. So that's great to hear. It was a really enjoyable project.
For the record, Ernesto, for all of you, that's AUSP to AUS. What he just described was what we would call internally the Alexandria Utility Sustainability Project that resulted in the new current utility system. So that's what that is.
Thank you. Okay, so let's spend just a few minutes here talking about why IRPs are beneficial. So as part of the IRP study, you consider solutions to bring to bear for any upcoming deficiencies in your power supply mix. Those solutions could be a combination of ownership options, renewables. You consider things like reliability locally, resiliency of your system, how those solutions might be brought to bear to increase those concepts. And then you think through a difference in length of period in those solutions. Do I want to pursue some of this shorter term or longer term? And then, of course, you've got the MISO market in play that ultimately dispatches those resources for the market. And so that very nature of their calling on the resources helps to, and you'll probably hear this several times, but it helps to hedge your load requirements and ultimately the cost associated with serving your power need. And then, you marry goals and strategic objectives that include diversification of your energy supply and thoughts around that, as well as being able to provide stable rates, competitive rates in certain situations, and you think about opportunities for economic development along the way. So just in general, the electric industry covers a top to local approach here. So we provide the schematic for reference here going forward, and we can leave you with this. But certainly what we're talking about today is sort of this top level, the wholesale power supply planning. In other words, where does ultimately the power for Alexandria come from? What resources or what combination of resources? And that's what starts there in item B, designated item B there. Some of those rules are overseen by federal agencies. And of course, the movement of electricity over power lines to local substations, ultimately works to serve your load need here locally. And there are a lot of things along the way that sort of need to be taken care of. But at a high level, we are focusing on the planning efforts around where does the power come from. So again, the benefit of IRP planning is to provide some semblance of a roadmap going forward. As part of the process, you contemplate any upcoming deficiencies, both on a capacity and an energy basis. And by working through this process and having these conversations like we are today, we can provide information to arm everyone with the ability to think through how to move forward. And so just that very act provides transparency to the process and an ability for folks to communicate any sort of goals and objectives that need to be considered along the way. Certainly that quote is relevant. You know, when you define your goals, it can lead to well-defined strategies that include a balance of different types of objectives that you all might be interested in, and that I characterized in the previous slide, a couple slides ago. So,
Ernesto, could you go back to that slide?
sure.
Your well-defined goals, well-defined strategies. The last one, reliability versus cost involved. Could you explain that to the members and the folks in the room?
Sure. So depending on the solutions that are brought to bear to serve your power supply requirement needs, depending on the type of resource or purchase, that decision could produce different outcomes depending on the market environment that's at play. The IRP study, keep in mind, is a 20-year projection. A lot can happen over 20 years. And so we'll talk a little bit about the thought process in approaching the study and how we account for that. But because a lot can change in the 20 years and the source of power could differ depending on the resource, that can certainly lead to volatility under different market environments. And so that's part of the consideration in creating what we'll talk about, these resource portfolios, as well as considering local reliability measures. There are utilities that consider battery storage as helping to bolster their transmission system, as an example. So that's part of the thought process, potentially, depending on the specific utility that might go into this as well. And certainly if you have a resource that's in your backyard, per se, to the extent there are emergency situations, there's a benefit to having that generator there locally, even though you could contract for something a little bit further away.
Yeah, and Ernesto, I'll just add along those same lines, another way to think about this is, maybe from your personal investments for long-term savings, like a 401k. Nobody ever encouraged somebody to save long-term by just investing in one stock, for example, right? We would diversify our portfolio so that we could reap the benefits when different things happen in the stock market or with different individual companies. It's not a lot different with your power supply resource portfolio. You're seeking diversification not because you're trying to get the lowest cost. You're seeking diversification and resiliency so you can obtain the most stable, reliable, lowest volatility in your power costs. And so keep that in mind, because if Alexandria didn't have any care about trying to stabilize their rate, the lowest cost thing for you to do is buy 100% of all your energy and capacity from the MISO market and not to plan or invest in any resources. And that solution is great, like 97% of the time. But the 3% of the time when it's bad, it's really bad. I mean, it could bankrupt, smaller utilities. And so this whole effort that Ernesto is describing here is designed to get you to think about other than just trying to attain the lowest power cost, what combination of resources would also obtain rate stability and minimize our volatility and exposure for our retail customers?
Okay. So just generally speaking, we'll revisit an illustration like this in a slide to come. But you know, we talked about some of the reasons and some of the things we're trying to balance as part of the IRP study there over the last few slides. We begin the analysis by certainly considering the load requirements in play and sort of categorizing the buckets of need, essentially. We do that on the energy side of the equation, and to the extent that those targets either deviate or confirm the existing resources that are brought to bear for the power supply mix, we then try to supplement those with additional options as part of the study. So the approach that GDS takes to the IRP, and we explain this as part of some of the reporting that came out, including the slides that you'll see a little bit further down about the results. We approach this whole study with this concept of building blocks. There are different buckets of assumptions that need to be thought through and that are specific to the utility that is undergoing this strategic effort. Things like developing a load forecast and considering variations to it in the future. All the way from load forecast to consideration of different assets, things that might be in play particularly for the utility undergoing the study, and we'll hit on that concept as part of one of the portfolio thoughts here in a minute, down to varying, in other words, stress testing the portfolios that we arrive at for the study. So we'll illustrate here the portfolios that this study contemplated and ultimately the outcome and recommendations that came from the process. So for the load forecast, we took several sources of data that included the list there off to the right. EIA information, Energy Information Administration, Census Bureau data. We incorporated, to a certain extent, considerations on historical weather and its impact. Typically folks approach a load forecast in what's called a 50-50, in other words, non-extreme type weather case. But that can vary depending on sort of the sensitivities you might want to consider as part of the study. And all of that was incorporated ultimately into these SAE, statistically adjusted end-use models that GDS forecasts. And it's a bottom-up approach. It's an industry standard way of approaching a load forecast and considering local loads, customer accounts, et cetera. And the strength in that type of modeling in bottom-up is that you can adjust the forecast in sensitivities quickly and efficiently, as opposed to trying to come up with a top-down overall number for the load forecast and then trying to affect it for the sensitivities that you study. So that's a little detail on the load forecast. For this specific study, we looked at a 20-year period, and we also included things like an EV growth forecast case. Now, I would describe that as a conservative look to the EV forecast. I believe in this study, based on the regional data that we were seeing, I believe we were assuming by the end of the study period that there was about a 15 to 20% market penetration of new vehicles that were EV related as one of the sensitivities, right? With the EV growth certainly if there is EV growth, it affects the load forecast. There's more load to serve. So we wanted to mention that a scenario that contemplates that was included within this study. Another bucket of assumptions that went into the study were the existing resources that you all have today. And some of the purpose of the study relates to this first resource that's listed here in the table to the right, the Rotamaker Power Station 2, which of your capacity need serves roughly 54 megawatts of need. So if we compare that to a peak load of, for round numbers, 150 megawatts, that's a significant portion of the capacity need. And that particular plant is being discussed as retiring potentially in the near future. And so given that volume and the issues a retirement could pose if that amount of power is left unhedged, sort of facilitated a need to study, well, how do we address that? How could we consider other resources to bring to bear to fill those deficiencies? So I wanted to point out that one specifically. And then, of course, you have DG Hunter, which is this recip plant, an aggregation of units there in one building that is essentially a gas specific resource. You also have peaking capacity from a power plant called Bayou Cove at 70 megawatts. You have a 10 megawatt hydro purchase. And then you've got up to a 40 megawatt capacity supply from CLECO. Now, back in the day when we first ran this study, CLECO served a greater portion of the city's need. As part of the negotiation that came out of that planning process and ultimately the solicitation process in seeking resources, we were able to strike a fair deal to incorporate other resources such as building DG Hunter and acquiring Bayou Cove in order to diversify your power supply need going forward and at the same time reducing what you purchased from CLECO.
Ernesto, let me just, a couple of times I'll have to interrupt to point things out specifically to members. So for all the members here, this is a really notable, and he's going to get in more detail as he breaks it down, but just this part on the bottom right is very notable to all of you, as you've heard from Trey and all of us. Sociopolitically, you face a lot of stuff out there that's said, particularly in this season, right? And some of that stuff may include, well, they just buy everything from CLECO and pass it on. So that's just not true. All you have to do is take the DG Hunter and Bayou Cove, which are assets you own, and add those two numbers, and you can see them compared to any other set against it. And importantly, you have the capacity, you have the ability to purchase up to that in these agreements. But for example, previous to the last 4 years, when we finished the AUS and structured it, and you had this in place, there was probably 1 to 2 years. Elaine and I have been talking. I can't remember exactly, so I'm not going to say exactly today how much we were purchasing then, but the number's very low, if you remember, John. In fact, I think there's a significant period of time where we weren't, and we were just using these other things as we moved ultimately into MISO. So it's just not true. When you're told that out in the community, it is grossly a misstatement of what occurs. And it wouldn't be our relationship anyway because you have assets. You're not a retail customer of theirs anyway. So That's not true, and you can see here, even if Rotomaker, and he'll talk about that in a minute, goes away, and we talk about doing new things, just add your 70 and 64 there of your own assets, and then he'll talk about how much we have to always have ready to go, and you'll see that. And so that'll be part of, at the end of this, what are we talking about going forward? What will we need in the future, and how do we get there? That's right.
Yes.
That's right. And so replacing that, to fast forward to the end, you're going to hear some conclusions about a solar piece that we want to talk to you about. But this is a real easy slide that ultimately we could break out and it could be used in your own community explanations, et cetera. But it just is a real gross misstatement, what I see that you constantly are told from this floor as you sit up there and hear out there. It's not true. And there you have the proof.
Yeah, so these days, as you can see there in the column to the right, you've got a diversity of resources, fuel types that you're bringing to bear. And that helps in case any one instance or development that affects your power supply comes up, like the Rotomaker retirement. And I want to point out, it's not shown here, for instance, and there's a difference between meeting capacity requirements, total peaks, and meeting your energy requirements, which is,
Explain that to them earlier,
yeah, which is volume. You've got to do both. On the energy side, good, prudent utility planning practice is, certainly from a public power perspective, is to know how you're hedging your energy volume, and at what cost. As Chris alluded to there earlier, you could rely on the market for everything, but if you were like one of those utilities that did that, and even utilities that were only exposed somewhat to the market, during Winter Storm Uri, for instance, within a period of 3 to 5 operating days, many utilities faced costs that were equivalent to their annual revenue total. And so several utilities had to go out and finance that. And they are still passing through costs under their monthly power costs to recover that and pay for it. So that's why hedging, consideration of how you're covering both your capacity and energy is crucial, especially when you get into these extreme cases that could occur. One other thought here, DG Hunter, the structure of that plant is a configuration of independent units. It's not just one shaft. And the capability of those units are such that they can ramp up and down very quickly. And what we are seeing, not only in the MISO market, but the Southwest Power Pool and others, is that that regional transmission operator, the RTO, MISO, that organization is calling on these types of units to shape around the continued penetration of renewable resources on the system. Yeah, if you think about additional solar on the system, cloud cover coming through, thunderstorms, et cetera, that can change the output of things like solar, or if the wind ceases to blow. Those intermittent type resources that you can't control the fuel supply per se. The market is picking up a lot of these other fast start capable units in order to meet that need. And certainly when we consider Alexandria's DG Hunter facility, you can see that because that plant has been called on far more than we actually originally anticipated. It runs historically about 70% of the year. That's 265 days of generation. Now it varies in the hours that it generates, mostly during on-peak periods for shaping purposes, but the market loves those.
And it runs at full load of 64 megawatts when it runs.
Another socio-political point for you guys. You are told constantly that that plant doesn't run, right? For all kind of reasons. Somebody didn't see smoke out the stacks. I told you the other day, if you see smoke coming out of the new DG Hunter plant, call me when something's really going wrong. Yeah, call the fire department. But you just heard the percent they're running, and he's going to explain to you, that's right. So when I was talking earlier about how that can be, because we're in MISO, what I'm saying isn't exactly how it works anymore, because we're into MISO for them to dispatch and do it. And he'll break that down, so I'm not trying to, but I wanted you to see what could be on that versus CLECO. That's not to knock CLECO, by the way. In fact, we'll talk about how that relationship can be enriched and do new things, but it's because of your leverage and the hedging you're doing again and all that, that you're in a position to negotiate from a position of strength because of this stack, as opposed to not having it.
And in addition to the reliability perspective, MISO will dispatch based on economics. So it is economical
They don't care,
for
they're not friends with anybody.
Hunter to run.
They don't care. They just go for what makes sense economically. And so if they're calling on us all the time, Reddix, what do you think that means if all they care about is the bottom line? We got the cheapest power. They have it.
Thought I heard
I
it.
think Chris.
Yeah, those are all great. Those are all great points about the way MISO dispatches the entire system, and particularly in the region that y'all are in. They do it by looking at the cheapest cost resources so that they can provide the lowest cost of energy for the collective load that they are serving, and DG Hunter is a part of that mix. And by the way, the mayor and Elena got me on my high horse right now. I want to remind everybody on this call in this meeting that DG Hunter facility is worth much, much more than the cost that you have invested into it, because it is a highly available, reliable, cost-effective resource that if you were going out and trying to replace that power plant today, like the same configuration, it would cost almost twice as much as what you got paid, 8 years ago. And so on top of that, it's our job, just like, what we do with our cars or our houses, if we want them to last, right, they're significant investments, then we have to maintain them. We have to invest in them to make sure they're getting the right maintenance, the right support. And that DG Hunter facility is like gold for the utility and for the retail ratepayers. It does so much. And I can assure you, everything you hear me saying right now, I'm not nearly as emphatic as I would be if I was there in person about this resource and the need for us to protect it and ensure it.
So, Chris, I hate to keep, but you're making points that I can't let you not make better. I want the councilman to hear this because, Chris, they face so much out there of easy criticism, and I want the commissioners to be empowered with that. MISO doesn't care about what's on Facebook, right? They care about money. And so what people hear and say, they're not caring about at the RTO. They're caring about what goes in because they're going to use that source. Ernesto was saying it, but I can't say it today like we said it then. When DG Hunter, the Wärtsilä units were built, or the Rice units, the reciprocating engines were built, it was then, and that's less than a decade ago, the fastest start, efficient start technology being used anywhere in the country. So I don't want to get too in the weeds with y'all, but there are units that take a long time, many, many hours to get into what we might call their sweet spot or cycle up. These things can do it by their guarantee in 5 to 7 minutes. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And that means 0 to anywhere on the dial, like a attenuator, like a volume knob. But when we put them in, although they had to claim 5 to 7, they were doing it in 3 to 4. That hasn't changed, this fast start technology, and that's what they're talking about. And I didn't fully know that. I'm glad to hear on it. So when MISO's looking around and looking for that, there we are again. So not just because we're totally efficient that way, that's part of it. But your plant is running. And it's by a third party. So forget audits for a minute where we're doing great and all those other things. There's a third party that uses what we have, and all they care about is what's most efficient and best cost for everybody they serve. So if they're calling on you as a third party, again, I know I'm harping on this point, what does that mean about your utility? If they're calling on you to deliver at best cost, efficiency, et cetera, what does that mean? They don't care about your politics. They don't care who's elected and not elected. They care about green.
Life expectancy for the longevity.
Well, okay, so that's, I think Chris was, he touching on that a little. Thank you, Jim. One or the other, the third big thing I hear from folks, and Mr. Washington, this is specifically with regard to some things we've talked about, is that if you didn't do this, what's on that slide, it would have been better to just be out, this costs so much a month, right? To have the assets, to borrow to do it. And what Chris, and I'll ask Chris, because I think he was about to touch on it. If you take what you're paying here, and you versus having done something with, say, a CLECO or someone else, and you're paying their demand charges and all that, Chris, people are telling them that that is a better and cheaper option. Could you quickly dispel that nonsense for everybody?
Yeah, I don't know how to say it's more nonsensical than what you're already saying. And just to maybe try to double down on that, the cost. This is a really prescient point, and that is unbeknownst to us at the time, 10 years ago, when we were making these decisions, when the city was making these decisions, people were voting on this and a lot of hand wringing, right? We're going, we're going to tear down this plant that we've had for so many years, and we're going to invest in something crazy and new and take all this risk, and it's so expensive. The irony of it is we were installing the most efficient, fast-starting generation, and even we didn't realize how valuable it would be with the proliferation of all of these renewable resources, as Ernesto was saying, right? Solar and wind, you can't count on them. You don't know when the sun's going to shine and the wind's going to blow. But guess what? DG Hunter starts up every single time that MISO calls on it. When the wind and the sun don't shine and blow accordingly, those units are up and running to serve the aggregate of the load. As a matter of fact, MISO could care less if Alexandria's load was 40 megawatts. If they needed all 64 megawatts to run the entire load in the region, they're going to call on that entire plant. And in doing so, it has been so much more cost effective than any of our other alternatives, especially today. So we would love to put together some more simple economics that just kind of show how cost effective DG Hunter is and all of the benefits that you get when it operates. Elena, we were just talking about this the other day. We prepare and provide information, cost information that shows how often your units, Bayou Cove, Rotamaker, the DG Hunter facility is dispatched, how much it runs, and when it does run, how much money it's being paid above and beyond its cost. And all of that net profit, if that's the way you want to think about it, that net margin, that comes back to the utility, to the retail ratepayers. It doesn't go into the pockets of CLECO or anybody else. It comes right back to you because you were the ones that invested and took that bet and paid the money to create that asset. So yeah, we'd be happy to provide even more information to drive that point home. But that is the truth.
One other thing anecdotally is just to let everyone know, since COD of Hunter units 5 through 11, it has been a model for others. It is really the shining star for Wartsila in the sense that we have had other entities, other utilities, co-ops contact us to find out how do we feel about it? How do we like these units? Because they're looking into it, and a lot of other entities have started to actually utilize and purchase the units that we have. And so we were one of the first to do that. So really commend the council for moving forward with that, because that was one of the best decisions that we could have made.
So in short, Chris and Ernesto, if you were to take this like we're making our comparisons at home, if you take this vehicle that was purchased and you think, and you have your note on it and everything else, it's gonna be paid off and have a sweet spot where these assets will still be usable for some time to come, where you're not paying your note. But more importantly, even while using them and paying the note, it is still the cheaper cost scenario than anything you compared it to out there at the time, and that included any PPAs, power supply contracts, or any other scenarios with CLECO or anyone else.
Correct.
Right. So when you hear that out there, guys,
Correct.
that's another false statement. And it's very far from true. It's not close to maybe, kind of, and we just made a good decision. It's vastly untrue. Thanks, guys.
And, you know, that's absolutely right. And certainly we have all the data and the information at that time we were making these decisions. And even today, let me just add one more element into this situation. You know, again, the utility and the city council making those bold decisions that they made, 8-10 years ago to go down this path. Today, in the state of Louisiana, I can't tell you how many of the electric cooperatives are in very dire straits because they are coming off of some long-term old CLECO-Cajun arrangements, and they are going into new arrangements. Some of them have invested like in some new generations, but they are basically all capacity. And the commission passed a regulation just in the past year that said, look, guys, you can't be short capacity. You can't rely on the MISO market and or others to kind of cover you. You gotta be able to point to your own capacity. Well, guess what? They are all scrambling, and when I tell you they're in a world of hurt, trust me, they are in a world of hurt that is going to cause them a lot of pressure, a lot of rate increases, because now they have to scramble to do things that you all had the foresight to do, 7 to 10 years ago, and now you're sitting in such a great place. Hence the reason we're doing this IRP right now and talking about, hey, it's possible that 3 years from now, Rotamaker could retire, and if it does, we want you to know that we are thinking about all of the potential issues that could come up so you can get ahead of what could be coming down the pipe. But as Ernesto is going to describe here throughout these slides, we are still, even with the retirement of Rotamaker, because of the diversity of all of your other resources, we are still in so much better shape than where a lot of these co-ops are right now.
Okay, so the text there is kind of small. I apologize for that. I think the high-level takeaway from this slide that we were trying to get across are that there are two facets to hedging essentially your power supply, your portfolio. Being in MISO, and even if you weren't, good utility planning practice, you have a load requirement. And so on the capacity side, we're talking about peak load. In any one given hour, how much power do you need to serve that highest load here at the city? MISO, because it aggregates load and resources, the planning target in participation with that regional market is, well, what are your peak loads during the market's peak load hours? Because they're aggregating everything. And so that's what's represented by the dotted line there for Alexandria. What is that planning requirement to the market? The amount of capacity you need to bring to bear. And you can quickly see that today, in that left-hand column, the resource stack that you have throws off some excess. And there's a conversation to come about possibilities for selling that excess capacity and providing to you all's bottom line. In other words, selling that to capacity to folks that need it, and at what price. So that's the situation we face today. However, when we look out a few years and Bayou Cove retires here, we're going to have a need. and that's approximately 15 to 20 megawatts of need with the dropping off of that particular resource. And as part of the study, although it's not anticipated to happen and it was not in detail studied, we also took a look at Bayou Cove and what it would mean if that plant retired, right? During these studies, you want to consider all sorts of possibilities. Our primary focus is on Rodemaker. We don't know what's going to happen there. We've been told, we're 3 years out, et cetera. We need to monitor those conversations. So this study is all about, well, what do we bring to bear in order to serve that need?
So for example, within our last 3 fiscal years, our peak was 175 megawatts. So that's within the last 3. And previously, the city has helped LEPA out with some capacity needs. We have done that in the past. The city is a wonderful partner with all of our other co-ops and munis that are around. We help whoever we can. Whenever we can. There was a co-op out of Texas that had approached us previously about a year or so ago, but that one didn't come to fruition. So it's not that the city will just sit on something. We make sure that whatever we do, it's what's best for all of our customers, which are our citizens. And so that it really is making sure that we do that. And so as Ernesto was saying, with Rodemaker, that is something that we are looking at a 2027 date. That date changes. But to make sure that we plan ahead of time, we have to make sure that we know what we're doing. And so we're using the data that they are presenting to us. One of the things, as he was saying, that they did look at was, what if Bayou Cove also wasn't there? What if we didn't have that peaking unit as well, just to kind of see where we would stack up? That is, of course, not something that we are actually recommending or looking at in any way, shape, or form, but because those are conversations that have been had in the past, that things that are out in the public, we just wanted to make sure, okay, so what does the data say? What happens if you remove that? And so, as you can see, there are gaps that would need to be filled.
Yep. So that's the capacity side of the equation. There's also the energy side, which is the volume. So every hour in sum total, what is the volume each year that Alexandria looks to serve in its requirements? And that number is roughly a little over 700 gigawatt hours. So because you have a resource mix and you turn it over to MISO and they dispatch it as needed, the projections of resource contribution to hedging your energy need is shown there in those bar charts. And to the extent that MISO doesn't call on your resources, it generally means that the market is cheaper than those resource costs. And so that's why you do see market energy there in the bar chart, but it's because it's economical to purchase those from the market at that time.
And Ernesto, that's back to your earlier point. It's fine that there's that. Anybody so you're making market purchases through MISO, it's great, but the time it's not, the risk, whatever you want to call it, those sensitivities are so blown up that if you get caught in one of those situations, it can bankrupt a place, right? And so because of what we have, that doesn't happen. We decrease the chance that it will have that adverse effect on us by this stack that we have, right? So even if all the time MISO would be fine, the moment it's not is so great a risk. The gravity of that harm is so great that by having this prevention we have in place, we reduce that to not only something we can live with, but opportunities that we're continuing to benefit from those opportunities that Elena described. Elena, too, you said the other day, and I laughed about it because it's a good way of saying it, on energy and capacity. Talk about, you know what I'm about to say, checking account versus savings account. I think this gets people so mixed up, and we can use it later when we break it further down for the council, when we don't have our experts here.
So we do use these terms a lot, energy, capacity, and sometimes it does get to be confusing. For instance, even with that CLECO arrangement that Ernesto was talking about, there is a capacity option, there's also an energy option. So do we want to call on it? Do we not want to? And so energy, I refer to, that's your checking account. I know how much I have, I know what I need, that's there. Capacity is your savings account, so that's your reserves. So if I go over, what do I need? So MISO tells us what we need, so we have to make sure that we have that capacity. So we have to meet both. So just think of it as your checking and your savings, and we need both.
So the only other thing to point out on the energy side of the equation, with Rotamaker dropping off, and we talked about roughly a 700 gigawatt hour need, that plant provides roughly between 200 to 300 gigawatt hours of energy. That's substantial. It's a third of your energy supply that will be open to market forces. And so on the capacity side, we're looking at numbers of 15 to 20 megawatts, a far smaller amount to meet our capacity planning targets. However, on the energy side, Rotamaker's retirement leaves us with a pretty big deficiency that we need to make sure we fill somehow. Hedge it appropriately so that we're not exposed to the market for that much. I mean, we're already in the market for a third of the time as it is when we want to be, when it's economical, but that much more power being purchased from the market with nothing to hedge means that we could be out in the market when it's uneconomical. So this leads into the next slide. When we talk about a 20-year horizon, there's so much at play. There's so much variability. How do you just take a static modeling approach in one form? You can't. So the IRP study contemplates these different avenues for the market environment to change. We just went through an election cycle. What's the outlook going to be like in a couple of years? Will Rotamaker proceed to retire? Things begin to get questioned, and so all of that has an interplay on the resource decisions you make, obviously. How much can you finance those resources if you're building something? How much do you think someone else will offer you as part of some sort of purchase agreement? And so those assumptions can certainly impact the resource costs that you consider or that you could face in the future.
Can I make a little more here too? Go back to that slide.
Sure.
So members, you're going to approach some serious stuff with the commission, but go back to what we had to fix coming back on the utility bills themselves, all of those issues, right, that you guys dealt with, were called about and everything else. So think about then that relationship to all of these things and going out to get an asset if we need it, to add solar at the end of this, to do those things. What do you have to go borrow? You have to have the stability of what we're describing, which is there, but you also want the optimum bond rating, right? So that you borrow money at the right rate. If you went to the bank, you want the lowest interest rate. Same thing here, exactly. And you get that through that rating. Well, if your rating suffers from poor management of the system itself, which you went through, and don't know how much y'all were told about it or whatever until now, but think about how that affects you. So that has to be fixed and in place for you to go do that so that you can continue what? To have this hedge, this physical market hedge that you have, that you've built, that you've invested in. And so those things all have to integrate and work together. And that's why it's so critical that we have the system itself run, not just the assets that can, not just the electrons flying around, but actually the billing and all those other pieces that go together have to be working right. And so imagine if people continue to say, we just don't want to We pay taxes, let's just not worry about the utility at all. Well, then all of this goes away, and guess what? When it's gone, then you're at the market's mercy. What do you think the cost will be then? You don't have these things in place because you're not maintaining them and you're unable to. This is your hedge against high-cost comparators out there. Everyone can say they don't want to pay any utilities, but you can't say it that way. It's, are my utilities high compared to what? And when you look at what we've built and what they're saying, still in the money for, Elena and them aren't bringing you this integrated resource plan because you're in trouble for something. They're bringing it earlier for you to continue to bet on what you did right and be that much ahead in the future. This is a good thing. This isn't something like, hey, y'all got to do this, or this is the opposite. This is good utility planning, resource planning into the future. That's what this meeting is about.
Mayor, I'd like to go on a little more what you were talking about. When they had that big freeze in Texas, was that all these gas prices went skyrocketing, people were buying market price, and their utility bills were going to up $1,000. And what happened was they couldn't pay them, so they had to just extend them over time to get rate increase to pay it off.
That's right. And so you didn't increase your rates to get when people got behind here for all the things we've been over. We'll talk about again another day. Instead, we used that project, that very good project called Restore, to allow people time. But there was no rate increase during it, right? And because we're back to hedging on this commodity volatility, and we're getting gas, and we're buying blocks, and we're buying it when it's low, and having that for the future. That had stopped, by the way. We left, we did it, it stopped. Now we're doing it again, and it's already doing things for us again. We gave you that report the other day. Ernesto talked about it earlier. We're able to bring a profit in, not on the backs of our customers, you guys who pay in Alexandria, but in the MISO market from others that then we can decide what to do with. So I'm just trying to relate it all back to why you do an IRP, why now, and why being ahead of the game is so critical. But this is for the next meeting, when I have the political part and the malfeasance part and what we need to plan. That is all of us reminding you, don't kick this can. Take this opportunity when you're in a good place to plan for the future when you don't know everything that can happen. We bet on natural gas, John. And there was criticism, if I recall, and everything else. And others bet on solid fuels. Remember? How'd that turn out? You know? We made the right bet. So let's continue to use a good position of strength, not just in bargaining with others, but for ourselves to think about future assets and things that we need to do.
Another thing is, since Jim brought up the freeze, what happened to Texas with ERCOT. So during C.U.R.E. and Viola, the different winter storms, if something like that was to happen here, if it impacted Alexandria, although we did have that, we did not have a storm rider on our utility bills. There is no storm rider. Whenever we are impacted by hurricanes, tropical storms, we do not have a storm rider. Your rate is your rate. We do not add any additional fees as other utilities go to the LPSC, the Louisiana Public Service Commission, and request that storm rider. We don't have a storm rider. So that is something that is very important, and we can do that because we have our own utility.
Explain what you mean we don't have a storm rider.
So whenever there is a storm, there is an incident that happens, for instance, Laura, all of the poles that were down, all of the different resources that we utilized, all of our friendly utilities, for instance, Tallahassee, everyone that came and assisted us, we did not add to anyone's utility bill, which also includes water, wastewater, gas, and sanitation. There was not an additional rate for a storm on their bill. We did not add any additional costs to repair all of that infrastructure that was damaged during that storm. We repaired it. We put people back on quickly, as soon as possible, quicker than others that are surrounding us, but we did not charge. Exactly. And those other companies charge. They went to the LPSC, and some of them on their bills have multiple riders for multiple hurricanes that are on there. The city of Alexandria has never.
Also for new facilities.
Yeah,
That's true.
that's a great example of why having a utility fund, right, some money set aside to deal with extraordinary circumstances is always helpful, right? I don't think there's anybody on this call or in the room that doesn't have a personal savings account, right? We do it for the very same reasons, for unexpected things that happen. And we want to make sure that our utility has the same sort of savings account, the ability to set aside funds for that rainy day, that extraordinary event where we can continue not to have to put surcharges on our retail customers' bills to fund those types of things. It's right. It's just part of prudent utility planning, and it's also what your rating agency loves to see. They get really excited when they see utilities putting aside money for those rainy days. That's what helps you maintain higher credit ratings, right, with lower interest rates. And the mayor was doing a great job of talking about that. I think we're all aware of that. Let me just add one more element to that. Not only does it affect your interest rate when you issue bonds, it also affects the price that you pay if you were doing any type of bilateral agreement with anybody out in the energy capacity markets. Now, we don't have that situation today because we don't have to go out and buy energy and capacity from anybody else other than CLECO. But if we did, they would charge you more if you did not have a higher credit rating. So I just want everybody to understand it goes across the board, just like the mortgage companies, right, don't want to lend you money if you don't have a good credit rating, or they'll just say, hey, I'm just going to charge you a higher interest rate. It works the same way in the electric industry. No difference.
So again, guys, no surcharges, no riders, and what were you allowed to do, council members, in Restore? On top of the amortization, you were allowed to do a one-time what? Lop off part of what people owe. Permanently lop it off, never has to be repaid because of that rainy day aspect of what we did. No one else was doing or could do that. That you get beat up for it, I'm sorry, because we've been over that, and that's not for today to beat up on it more, but what a ridiculous thing. That's why you were able to do it. And as Chris pointed out, it also helped us, believe it or not, that you had that and could spend it there. Someone else may go, well, then that's money that could have gone to some other infrastructure. I pay my bill on time. I'm now angry about that. Well, wait a minute. It also reduces, for third parties looking at us, the risk of that. Well, wait, the fund, look at all this that happened. So restore didn't just mean restore and help people that went through it. It was about restoring the utility itself into best practice so that it can project itself into the future. It was about fairness to ratepayers in the utility getting back in order. Again, a good thing. We win an award for it anywhere but, in your own land, as the old saying goes. Thanks, Chris.
Okay. So, given all of the things that could change with the landscape and the fact that there could be different market environments moving forward over the 20-year period, the study had to make some assumptions around, well, how do we look at that? And so the approach that we've landed on at GDS is, through the IRP study, is to model 3 distinct market environments themselves. So the base case represents the world we know today and what are market forward prices today. What are gas prices projected to be today? At the time of the study, we locked in some assumptions after talking through it. And as an alternative, we assumed an accelerated technology case whereby You have a lot of incentive to grow the renewable space, meaning it makes those options affordable, which stresses the system for which you're operating in. So just as an aside here, the way that's studied is we have hourly production cost dispatch models that model the entire MISO market. At the generator level, it runs through simulations of hourly pricing, and ultimately we extract anything that affects Alexandria's ultimate power costs from those models, those computer models. These are the assumptions that we push to those models. So for the accelerated technology, what are the impacts that occur because the market is heading in that direction? And so we push that into the models, we observe what happens, and we report upon that. The last market environment case was this concept of increased regulatory. Okay, well, depending on what legislation is out there, which has been talked about in extreme forms in the past, how could that affect what we might see down the road? And specific to that market environment, we introduced a cost that could be imposed by the government, for instance, in the form of a carbon tax. So if you generate more carbon, you need to pay more money to offset that carbon. And the use of that mechanism is simply to change the mindset about what are the next incremental resources that anybody would bring to bear. You're not going to bring a coal plant. You're not going to make decisions in a coal plant, less likely in a gas plant, if all of a sudden you have this artificial price mechanism imposed by the federal government that relates to cost to offset those emissions. So that was an important aspect to study, and we've been through different cycles, perspectives throughout even the last 5 to 7 years on, where people saw legislation like that landing. But we considered that as one of the cases, just to understand what would happen to some of these selections.
Ernesto, can you go back? That's one of the most important slides for the members. I know sometimes you guys may say, okay, some of this is sounding great, but you've got these folks that we have, and I'll go over this back in that plan from years ago, getting dedicated internal resources and top personnel to make sure it's running right. You should care, and that's part of what C.U.R.E does, is to have oversight to advise you, why are they doing the real stuff? So you can imagine that Roy Martin and Crest Industries, Lee, they're not sitting around not planning different case scenarios. Trump versus Kamala Harris being elected, all those things can affect whether, coal's back in or out. All of those things have to be thought about when you go years out, Rick, right? And so you have a base case he's described. He had an accelerated technology. I want, when we come back and break this down and talk further, remember this slide. And remember that your team, that Elena and those lead, are looking at different that's what we mean by sensitivities. Well, if the world changed on that end, are we planning for it? Well, if it changes this way, did we plan for that? Now, catch this. If at the end of this, he gets into a scenario where one or two, or even better yet, one scenario for your recommended future in integrated resource planning were to be the best in the base case, this case, or this case, what do you think your decision should be? Because imagine there's going to be some that are good for accelerated technology, right? Some that are good for this, and some that are good for that. But if you had one or two, or even one in a perfect world, if it just so happened that one scenario through all of these sensitivities was still the best scenario, what do you think you'd do? What would you be compelled to do? Right? So then the only risk becomes, did they do good work in each of those? Is their work projecting all of those factors? And we look at that too. But That's where this slide will be very important as C.U.R.E. ramps up more into the end of the year with you guys. Because this is what you should really want to know. What are y'all doing to predict the stuff you can't predict? Who are you using to help you predict what you guys don't know over at the utility? What resources do you have to give us recommendations? But that's why you hire them. But then we have to look at, what are y'all putting into this algorithm? How much information you really looking? And I'm proud to tell you guys, I've got 2 metrics for them. 1, we do look at what they're putting into it. And 2, I've got the best metric of all. They did this before, 10 years ago. And I see the result of it today. So if I look at the 1 metric of, did you do well before? I got an A+ on that one. From my end, from your end, and so here we are. Remember that slide.
Yes, so this slide generally describes the various study assumptions and what their severity were as part of each of these 3 market environments. This is generally a conveyance of those assumptions on pricing, whether it's fuel or the cost of renewables, et cetera. During our build-up to the report, we detailed each of these and the assumptions we were making around cost or consideration of costs or what was to come at base, low, high levels that corresponded with this matrix here. And we reviewed that with the city. This is more of a high-level overview, just to give you a feel for, well, this is how we approach the sensitivities, and these are the variations to the specific assumptions that we had as part of the study. So then from there, once we work up to, well, how are we going to study all of this? We then move on to, well, what are the resource portfolios that we want to consider in the study? We're not going to study just plugging in one resource solution in this effort. We're going to look at a mix of different approaches. That helps us sort of establish, well, what are the buckets of resources that really rise to the top when you consider these different market environments? So all of these factors were contemplated. You know, what was the fuel supply for each? Are you buying something from somebody? Are some of those costs outside of your hands as part of an agreement like that? And when do you time these purchases and when you might be back on the market if, for instance, you were buying products from a particular company? We always preach diversification in resource planning because it hedges different ways the market could go. And I think I've covered this, but we considered things like new builds, utility scale solar or wind, battery energy storage as part of these resource portfolios, and potentially purchase power agreements with a third party, like what you have with CLECO. When we took a look at the vast list of the options, we then segmented, okay, what's really viable? What could we really do or go after versus what is technologically limited at the time of the study or cost ineffective based on our experience. So when you see things like biomass facilities, burning wood chips, the costs aren't competitive on a facility like that at this time to really have made them viable throughout these market environments that we were studying the portfolios against. Things like hydrogen, fuel-based options are not ready for public consumption yet. There's a lot of hypotheticals on that and when certain targets are to come, 2030 and beyond. Also in that category, things like small modular nuclear reactors, which could provide a great solution down the road were still being felt out as part of, any sort of long-term resource plans. The technology just has not been established yet, and the costs associated with that were through the roof. So we married those potential options with what you have in place now, and we considered your load profile and your categorical need for when those volumes were needed. So I'm not sure how familiar folks are with time of need, but typically this is structured as base load, intermediate, peaking, and reserve need. And it just speaks to how often you might rely on a resource. That's what those categories represent. So looking specifically at Alexandria's load and how much load you need every hour, we were able to segment, okay, well, volume-wise, you're looking for about 60 megawatts of your peak load at a high load factor most of the year, 80% above. For intermediate resources that can ramp up and down, like DG Hunter or other gas supply options, those are considered intermediate. The market relies on them, but perhaps not year-round. And so that's another category of need. And the reason you do that is because these different types of resources can serve those needs in that fashion. I mean, just physically, that's how some of the resources operate. And so you can begin to then address the deficiencies and your selections to build up the portfolios by isolating thoughts like that about, well, what do you really need for good utility planning practices? We don't want to overbuild. We don't want to oversupply. But what selections should we make? Taking that a step further, and I won't belabor this, but we marry that concept with more detailed studies about, if you were purchasing your need from somebody, there are standard block products out there to transact upon. And so we took a look at your load after your existing resource performance, and we just got a sense of what those volumes were, so that if a resource portfolio mix included those types of resources, purchases from somebody else, block purchases, we could size them accordingly, okay? So all of that to say, we followed up on conversations about what are the goals for Alexandria. Rate stability obviously is a big one for a lot of public power entities, as Chris mentioned earlier on the call, resiliency of the system, diversifying your portfolio, et cetera. And as an outcome to that process, we established essentially 7 resource portfolios. I say 7 because as part of the study, we also took a look at, well, what if you did nothing? What if you just proceeded with your deficiencies with the resources that are left over after Rodemaker's gone, and how would that portfolio perform under the same market environments? And so that's the benchmark you're comparing against these new 7 portfolios of resources. So there's a long list here of what we assumed for each portfolio. We named each portfolio something that made sense or alluded to the selections that were made incrementally in each of those portfolios. As an example, I'll just highlight a couple and we'll move on and maybe hit upon some thoughts with the results. Portfolio 2 was termed new gas expansion. So that was a combined cycle. It was doubling down on gas, but in a different technology, larger scale than your current recip configuration. And at the same time, adding a unit to your DG Hunter facility.
Would you have another bag over here?
Yep. So that's an example of a portfolio we looked at. A few of these portfolios look at different things. Portfolio 4 was trying to bring in completely everything over and above that you needed, just bringing it in on a renewables basis, a mix of solar, wind, and battery storage, and let the results fall out as they may under the market environment and compare it to the reference case, right? And then the last one to highlight here, which we'll revisit, Portfolio 8, and there's different variability in what we selected in each of these. And Portfolio 8 is, okay, what happens if I incorporate solar into my mix, paired with an additional unit at my existing DG Hunter site? So that variability then begins to, when you see the output, you begin to piece together, okay, if I go after my deficiency in these manners, how might my power costs be affected at the end of the day? So this is really detailed, but I think it's important to point out, it's one thing to say, for instance, you have 100 megawatts of solar, and it's another to say that the market counts it as 100 megawatts of solar. So depending on the resource selection, the market values that capacity that you bring to the table differently. So even though on a nameplate capacity basis, this is a capacity look, meeting your peak planning need with these portfolios, even though there's a difference in where the bars stack up to, when you see solar or wind or battery storage, the capacity side of the equation actually gets decremented because, and this, the rules with MISO are still undergoing constant change on how much capacity you can essentially accredit for the resources you have. Solar, because of its intermittent nature, they say you can roughly count 50% of that capacity value. And that's expected to decrease over time as more solar hits the system.
Do you use batteries with solar?
You can. You can pair them together.
To store when
Mhm.
you know.
Yep. And that combination helps you to keep more megawatts of accreditation from that facility. MISO treats that a little bit different than if it was just a solar plant or just a battery storage device.
I said more and more people going solar, and it's only sometimes then another one, Zealand, might be a money maker for us. I just feel that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, and that concept of storing the energy also helps a utility if they have sort of an active management of the facility, helps them to discharge the solar at different hours. Maybe even use that to shape up like the gas plant's doing and discharge it at favorable hours to help the market, right?
Yeah, and to add just a little bit more color to this, what Ernesto is trying to describe about the MISO and their rules around capacity is that not all capacity is created equal. Not all megawatts are the same. Just like we have different cars that can do different things on the road. A really great example of this is our DG Hunter facility in the summer and in the winter. MISO, in both those seasons, MISO says, hey, your nameplate capability is 64 megawatts, and we're going to give you, because of our rules and the process, the systems we use to credit capacity, we're going to give you like 60-something megawatts of capacity accreditation. Now take a 100-megawatt solar facility. That same, it's nameplate rated at 100 megawatts, meaning during the summer, there will be hours where you could get 100 megawatts out of that solar facility. What MISO does, after they get done with the rules, summer, they say, hey, that 100 megawatts is worth about 35 to 40 megawatts of capacity accreditation today. During the winter, it's worth about 0. And oh, by the way, for everybody that keeps installing solar, it's going to get worse. 5 years from now, that same 100 megawatt solar facility in the summer, MISO is going to give it about 20 megawatts of capacity accreditation. And the winter will still continue to be 0. Whereas something like DG Hunter will continue to get 60-something megawatts of capacity accreditation. So MISO is driving a hard bargain to make people do things like, hey, you want to add that solar? We better add something like battery storage to help make it a better capacity resource.
Yeah, and there's a balance here, and part of what went into choosing volumes here also had to do with, what we were talking about there was the capacity side of the equation. How do you meet your capacity requirements? But if the facility is 100 megawatts, and when we're talking about on a volume basis during the summer, on the energy side, if it's producing 100 megawatts, you get that. That's not discredited. And so it becomes a balance of, okay, how do I think it'll operate and recover costs in the market on the energy side versus, well, how much credit do I get on the capacity side? You have to meet both sides. And it's when you test the selections in different market environments, you can then begin to see how that might factor into your overall power costs. So yes, it gets discredited on the capacity side quite a bit in comparison with the gas plant, but there's value in it on the energy side, potentially depending on the cost that suppliers would offer you as part of that purchase agreement. So wanted to make that distinction there because those bars sort of shrink. And to also allude to, well, we're also balancing the energy side, which is not highlighted in the same visual. So how do we effectively think about the outcomes? This was a process we underwent with the city and sought feedback to say, what are the things that are important to you all? And we have sort of a structure to being able to take that feedback in and working we worked with you all to apply weightings to ultimately land on a scorecard effort for some of these results. So things that were, are typically thought about are, just expected costs from the portfolios in general. I mean, that's very important, right? Do the portfolios have an elevated level of resiliency? I mean, is it local build? I mean, do I have local solutions as part of this incremental portfolio? How much do I have to bond or go out and, finance, essentially? And that could be more important to some utilities versus others. So those are the types of criteria that we talk through and arrive at ultimately, well, what are the specific criteria that are important to Alexandria? Then when we do that, we weight those criteria. We come to an understanding of, well, what's most important, what's next most important, et cetera, and what matters, and roughly how much. And by working through a point system with some scoring mechanisms and assigning points, we then have a weighted score for each portfolio. And we've had detailed conversations on that prior to this, so I'm trying to sort of set up the structure for which the study went through, not to belabor it today, but it was a detailed conversation.
We can unpack that too with them later, Ernesto.
Yeah, we.
I want you to know how much I love that whole scorecard.
Yeah. Along the way, we had at least 3 detailed presentations, if I'm remembering the number right, that delved into, okay, well, what are the assumptions and what's the base case market, what's the accelerated tech market, and what are the different buildup of assumptions. Here you're just seeing sort of hopefully top-level outcomes for the process and what we went through. So the study, something important to note also is the study focuses on incremental costs. So for instance, if you look at the numbers above the bar charts and you see $44.30 per megawatt hour, that's not total power cost for Alexandria. It just references, hey, what are the true incremental costs that differ between these portfolios? Because what matters in the study is what's the difference between the portfolios in relation to each other. We weren't trying to go through a whole detailed analysis of what's on the books, getting every single cost into this study. That's sort of wasted effort. But what are the things that change portfolio to portfolio? And that begins to sort of highlight, well, how much will costs go up? Or how much potentially could costs go down in these market environments? And then that can be applied to the total price type cost look eventually. So under the base case market, what we saw was your current portfolio, which is highlighted there as portfolio 1, reference case, it does pretty well.
Not just pretty well.
I mean, it's one of the lowest. It's one of the lowest.
Drop Mike on y'all's decision, John Scott. Just not doing anything is number 2.
Yeah.
That was 10 years ago. If I'm in court, rest. But it can get better. But that's number 2, guys. You cannot stress that enough. Your base case today, doing nothing, came in second.
Yeah, so it came in second when you consider that base look forward for the next 20 years. It continues that competitive position that we're seeing today. I mean, it makes sense, the decisions you've made. Now, of course, the base case doesn't assume extreme market, right? We start to see that as we move through the market environments, the 3 different ones, right? So this is base case. However, there is one portfolio that provided a little bit lower cost from what we saw from the data, and that was the selection around incorporating some solar in a size that made sense, considering capacity and energy, and adding a unit at that Rice facility. You have the pad there, so it eliminates the totality of having to build a new infrastructure to house 10 units, right? I mean, it's cost effective to be able to, and it's one of the advantages of those Wärtsilä units. They're modular. You can drop one in, and it sort of helps you on the cost.
Do those rates take into effect the cost of acquiring these new assets?
Yep, the financing costs, yep. So we had some assumptions as part of one of the, as one of the package of study assumptions, we assumed, well, what's the cost of debt? What if we had to finance something and it's layered in there as a fixed cost? It doesn't vary with the market or energy output. I mean, if you invest in that unit, all of the cost is in here.
Your detractors keep telling you as members, they're trying to differentiate that these aren't all-ins. They're all-ins. So this is you paying the note on the vehicle and everything versus somewhere else paying a demand charge and all, like, these are all-ins. We wouldn't give it to you if it weren't, so that you're comparing apples to apples.
Is this partnering with someone in the sun, I'm with solar, that, how y'all did that?
Yeah, so we assumed during the study that when you acquire solar for your portfolio, it is under a purchase power agreement where another supplier takes on the risk to develop it, and then you agree to a certain price over the life.
Yeah, a fourth of it, a fifth, half of it.
Yeah, and there have been, since the study was completed, there have been more advancements in the federal incentives out there. I mean, there are utilities, municipals, and co-ops considering self-build solar, because there are direct pay incentives for utilities to do that, right? Where the developers saw the benefit was they got tax savings as part of the federal incentives. And so, I'm sorry?
You know, Demco built their own solar.
Chris, do you know? Did you say Demco?
Yeah.
And what was the specific question about Demco?
I don't know if you.
They buy their own solar or build their own solar, what they do.
That may be beyond.
Oh, sorry. I don't know anything specifically about Demco's activities. I do know that, there was another set of those cooperatives that at one point were chasing 3 different solar PPAs, and all 3 of them fell through. But I'm not even exactly sure what happened, right? If it was a developer issue or what. I just know that they weren't able to pull the trigger, but I don't know specifically about Demco.
And Chris, we talked about that internally, what you were just saying. We'll brief them in the public, but at the next meeting, we can talk about some of those attempts.
Yes, sir.
I just hate to not get it exactly right, because this is a public record we're making. Since we're talking about third parties.
Okay. So it's hard to see when you move from slide to slide, but essentially what occurs when you consider the accelerated tech market environment is that given the assumptions around the buildup of what's at play and the cost of these different resources, just costs overall in general, if I could speak to that first, on average, they go up about $12 per megawatt hour. And that's because gas prices are higher. A variety of those assumptions. You see more renewables on the system. There's more volatility of market prices, et cetera. However,
In the accelerated tech, it came back in first again.
yeah, but relatively speaking, when you consider your other pathways forward, it performed well. It responded well to those price signals. I mean, everything's layered in, cost to acquire them, cost of fuel supply, et cetera. And so that's where you can begin to see, okay, well, maybe some of these move higher than others under this set of market environment assumptions. And then lastly, again, this doesn't do a good job of showing the extreme nature of these costs. But then when you consider the federal government possibly instituting a carbon tax, and we assumed something on the lower side from all of the historic proposals, but enough to incent folks to switch from coal to gas at about $40 a ton. Again, the costs move up, and for some of these portfolios, the costs double in dollars per megawatt hour. So, again, because the solar is carbon-free in this case, right, those costs are not applicable, right? So, again,
So we can close and down. The 8th scenario, which is the RICE plus solar, in all 3, in base case and the 2 sensitivities, comes in first place.
Yep. So the weightings for the key criteria and what the city landed on are there, as you see. Expected power cost was important, weighted at 35% of the score. Rate stability at 15%. Resiliency, local options at 20%. Sustainability, investment into renewables was scored at 10%. And, well, how much bond financing did the portfolios need? That was weighted at 20%, right? The more bond financing you need, perhaps the more you'd shy away from it, or it would score negatively, right? So Those weightings were applied, and there was some buildup there that ultimately landed on this scoring matrix. So if I move ahead, when the points were applied for each of these key criteria, because of the selections in the portfolio and because it addressed these different key criteria, Portfolio 8 rose to the top. It performed well economically. It provided some additional local generation. It got the city into a portion of renewables for its need. It's not going to serve 100%, but it begins to move in that direction to have something in there for diversification. And then again, with the purchase power structure to the solar, that's not financing you're taking on in-house. That's on the developer. So it scored well in that category. So rounding out the score, it scored high. So the recommendations of the report that we provided, the city needs a substantial amount of energy resources, not capacity, as we saw. There's a difference in the planning need. And so those portfolios with renewable resources providing mostly an energy benefit helped stabilize the power cost volatility that we saw, the fluctuation of power costs, the potential fluctuation. And the fact that dropping in a new unit is cost effective also provided for support in that particular portfolio that, it landed on some lower costs as an outcome. So the recommendations of the report were to consider adding a unit at DG Hunter, conduct an RFP for new solar, some sort of new solar resource that you can weigh the pricing, get educated, do some price discovery, and then consider it for your portfolio. It would help diversify it some. And then there was this thought about also thinking through some block hedging as well as an alternative for a transitionary type period.
Thank you. All right. So guys, we'll start next time when if we don't have the guys here in person, we'll definitely have them on the phone. We'll probably start with this slide and work a little back on some of those last ones for you guys internally when the whole commission is here, and maybe dig in a little more. I think y'all kind of get the picture of what would be recommended when you look at it, obviously, but there's still more that y'all can tinker with and think about. I guess my first question, Ernesto, would be, look, it seems to me that if you were to pick number 8, you could think about doing the RICE unit now as you work through the other and start a process, and or vice versa. And if there's the solar is there's a developer cost there that, we just start those two processes. We start an RFP on the solar and think through it. I want to just commend all of the team, Elena, you and Marcus and Mr. Marcotte before you for getting us into this point. But I'd like to also commend David Crutchfield and David Johnson for their work on this years ago. Mr. Trey Gist was also instrumental years ago. Mr. John Scott and Mr. Chuck Fowler have been instrumental to this. Also, our other members, John Carroll's on the line. I'm going to start forgetting all the original C.U.R.E folks unless somebody helps me. I'm glad to have June on now with us to see this and to help tell this story and think about what we need to do. But just if you go back to our current base case and think about how it's performing, and even how it would perform if we did nothing, if we didn't do 8, you should feel really proud and happy about where we ended up in this. So it's sort of a good position to be in, and now you're thinking about, could we hedge a better position out of it? And maybe, depends. Trump has won, and I don't know how that will portend on solar. You think about the politics of all of those things, but I my guess is if you look at things, no matter who says coal will come back and be king, that's not likely under any scenario, no matter what anyone says, right? And then the technology for solar increases and increases all the time and gets better. And so maybe there's a benefit somewhere down that road, even just politically for us to have that piece in play. You have a lot of pressure from people who are worried about the environment and other things. Both the C.U.R.E commissioners will hear it. I know you guys hear it out there. There's just a lot of reasons to think about that piece. And if it happens to be in the money, then it becomes, as we say, the no-brainer about what to do. So, on the next one, we'll have the full commission. We'll talk a little more. I'm going to open up for you to ask Ernesto and Chris any questions that you all have. And I'm going to retire away and let y'all do any talking. Obviously, no votes today or anything else, but feel free to ask your consultants anything that you need to ask them, and they'll answer. Or Elena or Marcus are both in here, too. Ms. McGill's is in here. And thank you for your time, guys. I really appreciate it. I hope this was very beneficial for all of you.
Do y'all have any questions?
What were we talking about?
Only Chuck.
Explain to me basically what a 100 megawatt wind farm looks like.
Well, that would not be local.
Okay, so this would be, okay, so this
Yeah.
is also going to be purchased, that's a purchase agreement, not our own facility.
Yeah, so the solar developer would site that somewhere where they have land and somewhere where perhaps it's favorable cost-wise, because all of these developers want to offer you a competitive price, especially if you go to solicitation on this. We've seen instances in running renewable RFPs where we've got over 30 entities vying for the business. And so we establish a short list, move forward materially with a few, and just try to understand where they're going to land on cost and what the value proposition is based on location, total package, location, how that affects their cost to you, the interplay with the market, your net position, et cetera.
How many days of sunshine should we get?
And Ernesto,
Yes.
hey, I was just going to add, it's interesting about solar facilities. There's certainly been a lot of folks looking to develop solar facilities in Louisiana. You basically can get about 1 megawatt of solar facilities on about 5 acres of land, 5 or 6 acres of land. So, even 100 megawatt facility can take up a sizable chunk of land area. But the Inflation Reduction Act, right, subject, of course, to any potential changes by the Republican administration, to change it. But currently, what makes it so attractive for folks to pursue and these developers to install it is, you can obtain a cost reduction of 30 to 40% of the capital cost can be covered by your federal government. And so it is quite an immense amount of activity being done, partly because of that underlying driver, that investment, those investment tax credits. And of course, the other thing is, right, there's a pull, right? There are folks that are demanding, and I'm sure you guys have seen it, right? You look around like a Google and a Facebook, Meta, on the kind of like as a large industrial player, Walmart, right? They'll say, hey, we want more green energy, or sometimes retail customers. So you got a little bit of a push-pull going on to develop it, but I bet it's Ernesto and I would share with you guys a Louisiana map, state map right now. Ernesto, what do you think? There's probably like 50 projects under development across the state right now.
Yeah, easily and being studied, yeah.
A lot of them are actually using what was farmland at some point. So because it does take up so much acreage, there have been a lot of farmers who have leased their land to solar developers that way.
Ernesto, I'm sorry. Where does climate change play into looking at the future and solar and things like that? Is climate change part of the evaluation?
Not as a premise for considering certain resources. I'd say the connection it has with the study perhaps is that, for instance, in that market environment where you have increased regulatory, the reason the government would put in a carbon tax is because they want to change the generation mix. So it's sort of an indirect way to include some thoughts about it, but it was not a direct consideration. Oh, we have to put in solar because there's climate change as a part of this. It's more of, okay, what are the assumptions at play? And if the government adds cost to our traditional generation, how's that going to impact us if we don't have solar or renewables?
So we looked at it more so on the federal
And-
level,
and
because
either-
that really would be the impact is on the federal level. Louisiana has not become one of those states where they're requiring a certain amount of renewables by X date. So we were looking at federal.
That's a great point, yeah. Yeah, we run.
And another thing that is attractive about a solar resource is, remember, Rotamaker, as it burns coal, it is still a kind of a fixed or non-gas resource, right? The cost of coal is not tied to what the price of natural gas does. So when that resource retires and it's no longer serving us or providing power to Alexandria, what solar does is kind of provide another energy hedge against natural gas at a more fixed rate, right? A lot of these PPAs are just fixed cost structures, so it does have a number of different elements that are beneficial.
Yeah, and if we're concerned about land usage and the proliferation of renewables and converting farmland to solar facilities, right, that concept does exist. But at the same time, some of these coal plants that are retiring, they take those sites and they just redevelop them into these types of offerings. And so, and sometimes you have rights to that based on your historical participation in, for instance, Rotamaker. So if they were to contemplate doing that at Rotamaker, you might have an option at anything future there. It would just depend on legal review, et cetera. You need a legal opinion and all that.
And cost.
Yeah.
Is there anything else?
Thank you, that was great.
John,
Which
do
I
y'all have
understood
anything? Well, thank y'all very much, and with that, we will call this commission meeting to an end. Thank you.